Principles and Elements of Design, Part 2, Repetition, Harmony, Contrast, Integration, and Dominance. Hello, I'm Charles Bernard, and this is a continuation of what you were studying in Part 1. The artist must organize his or her elements in the picture to create a rhythm. This rhythm must be appropriate for the effect he or she wants to create. Rhythms may be violent or quiet, smooth or staccato. The key to a successful picture is finding the answer to the question, what is most appropriate? What kind of rhythms does this picture need to express the mood that I want to communicate? Let me give you an example of how contrasting elements of design are integrated. Now, I think what I'm going to do is pick up this color here, the yellow-orange, and add that over here. Then I think I'll pick up the blue up here. Pick that up and add that over here. So I have a circle and a square. Two sharply contrasting elements of design, shape and color, as well as value. And let me show you what the value looks like in case you can't see it. The circle is a dark value and the square is a light value. Now both shapes are of similar size and they both have a smooth texture. However, the property of texture and the property of size together are not enough to resolve this conflict that exists between them so that they become a cohesive whole. In other words, so they are unified or integrated. Once they become integrated, they will become a cohesive whole. They will become unified. Unity means cohesion or consistency or oneness. And right now, that really doesn't exist here. To create a stronger bond between these two contrasting shapes, to integrate them, what needs to be done is the value needs to be changed. Either the value of the square or the value of the circle. So that, let's say, the value of the circle is the same value as the value of the square, or vice versa. What I think I'll do is I'll change the value of the square to the same value as the circle. That means I have to select a different value on the color picker here, a darker value, like this. And now I'll check the black and white version to see if the values are similar. They are similar, but I can go a little bit darker on the blue square. Like this. Now I'll check it. I cleaned up the shapes a little bit, and now both shapes have the same value. And even though the shapes contrast sharply with each other and have different colors, or hues as colors are referred to, nevertheless, the two contrasting shapes have been integrated and therefore unified. These two contrasting shapes share certain properties, not just the same value, but the same size and the same smooth texture, as I mentioned earlier. And because of these several properties that both contrasting shapes share, it forms a bond between these opposing shapes, integrates them, unifies them. The more properties that are repeated, such as value and texture and size and direction and color, and line, the more integrated they become, and therefore the more unified they become, the stronger the bond or connection between them. The less properties that two or more shapes share, the less they are connected, and therefore the greater the contrast between them. And when the contrast becomes extreme, when they don't share any of the properties, the elements of design, line, shape, texture, color, size, direction, value, and when they're all different, then of course you have what I referred to earlier as discord. But when they start sharing more of the same properties, or they have those properties in common, more of those properties, then the stronger the bond becomes, and the more harmony there exists between them. Harmony has different degrees of contrast. Actually, harmony embodies both unity and contrast, or repetition and contrast. Here you see that I changed the color of the square. Now there's more harmony. There's less contrast, less conflict between the two contrasting shapes. And the result is an even stronger bond between these contrasting shapes. So I've repeated a color that is found within both of these colors, and that color is red. Both these colors have red in common, so they are sharing the same hue. There's a repetition of hue. This shape, the circle, is actually orange. When you look at it in the color picker, you see it's an orange color that has been reduced in its intensity. And there is red in orange. And then the square contains red as well. So both colors have red in common, and therefore that is what integrates them, unifies the colors. But since there is variation, there's orange and there's red, the result is harmony as well. As I mentioned, harmony actually consists of both repetition and contrast, and that's what you find here. Here, however, there is greater harmony than in the previous example, in which the square was blue. When more of one or more properties, such as the elements of design, line, shape, texture, color, size, direction, and value, are seen over another, then dominance is achieved. And through dominance, unity is established. A stronger unity is established. That means that one of these shapes needs to be enlarged. So by enlarging the red shape, there is now more of this one particular shape than the other. The other is smaller. Also, there is more of one particular color, the red. There is more red than there is orange. Harmony and unity are not necessarily synonymous. When you have established harmony, you won't necessarily automatically also will have established unity. While unity involves integrating opposing properties like I did here, resulting in some amount of unity, the unity, however, isn't really very strong, because these properties are competing with each other, since there isn't more of one than the other. There's the same size that both these shapes share, so the eye doesn't really know where to rest. It keeps jumping back and forth between the square and the circle, and the circle and the square. And the same with color. There's a conflict. The eye is torn between one and the other. This kind of conflict, where you don't see more of one color or shape or size or direction than another, needs to be resolved. And the way it's resolved is through dominance. By making one shape larger in size, for example, now I have more of the square and less of the circle shape. I also have more of the red color. I also have more of the red color than the orange color. So therefore, the red dominates over the orange. Now the eye is no longer in conflict between these two shapes. It's this shape and its color and value that attracts more attention, is dominant over this shape and color and value. Conflict refers to the eye being torn between two or more shapes and not really knowing where to rest. It just keeps jumping back and forth. So therefore, a dominance needs to be established. And when you add contrasting shapes and colors, let's say I add this triangle here. Right now, that triangle shape is not part of these two shapes. It's isolated from those two shapes. It has not formed an alliance with these two shapes. In order to form an alliance with them, one or more properties that these shapes have needs to be repeated within the triangle. Just as I showed you that I repeated several properties within these shapes, thereby integrating them. So this triangle needs to be integrated with these shapes. And the way it's done is to integrate that triangle by having that triangle form an alliance with one of the dominants. So, for example, if I made that triangle a red, that triangle now shares the same color. The triangle has something in common with this shape here. And therefore, the triangle forms an alliance with this dominant color. It has been integrated into the rest of the shapes, not only by way of color, but also the same value. It now shares the same value that the circle has, as well as the square. So it's no longer isolated. So you need to form alliances which will then connect certain shapes with other shapes so that they're all tied together into a unified whole. I cleaned up the triangle, as you can see, and now all the values are the same. You see? A more interesting result will happen when, instead of making all the values exactly the same in order to integrate these contrasting shapes, you can still integrate them by having the values similar and not the same. And therefore, when the values are similar, you have harmony of values. And harmony of values means that there is some variation of values, which will make this arrangement here more interesting when you've introduced some change. What I'll do, I think, is make the value of the large square a little bit lighter. Now, I can't make it too light, or it won't harmonize with the other values. So let me pick out that color and then come over here to the color picker and make it just a little bit lighter in value, like this. Now there is variation of value, but all of the other shapes and colors have been integrated nevertheless, so that the overall result is one of harmony. They all harmonize with each other and are integrated. Now let me show you what the value looks like, and you can see that that value is a little bit lighter than these values here. Therefore, this value has been harmonized with these two values because the values are similar, not exactly the same like they were before. If they're exactly the same, then repetition is introduced, and repetition is the way through which unity is achieved. However, by varying the value here, making it a little bit lighter, I've introduced harmony, harmony of value. Within a composition, you find harmony, repetition, and contrast, which is what you find within this arrangement. So all three are combined within a composition. Earlier I showed you how to resolve conflict between shapes, colors, values, textures, and so forth. Here, again, there is conflict. They're all competing for attention. This is what you need to avoid in your compositions. Remember what I showed you on how conflict can be resolved. It can be resolved by dominance, which means that one of these competing shapes, one of these competing colors, one of these competing values must dominate over the others. And that resolves this conflict between all of these colors and values and shapes, where you're jumping from one to the other. You don't know which one to focus on. And that dominance is achieved by establishing more of one kind of color, more of one kind of shape, one kind of size, one kind of texture, one kind of value, one kind of direction, one kind of line. In other words, all the elements of design. So when I enlarge one shape, like I did before, now there's no longer a conflict between the sizes, because one size dominates over the other. I've established dominance of size. There's also more of one color, the blue. And there is also more of this value than the other values. So I have dominance of color, dominance of value, and dominance of size, as well as dominance of shape. The square is the largest shape. Whenever you establish a dominant, you also in turn then have subdominants or subordinate elements of design. And these are the subordinates. Subordinate color, subordinate shapes. They must be integrated into one or more of the dominants, which means integrated in terms of the subdominants sharing the same color or the same value or similar colors or similar values. They don't have to be exactly the same, as I pointed out to you earlier, in order for them to be integrated into the dominant. So since this is the dominant color, I can integrate this contrasting shape here with the dominant color by repeating that color within the triangle. So now I've integrated this subordinate shape. Or I don't have to repeat the exact same color. I can change the color a little bit and thereby establish harmony of color. Let me change that some more. And this contrasting triangle shape is still integrated with the dominant color because they are in harmony. I'm harmonizing the color of the triangle with the color of the square here. They're similar. They both have a color in common, which is the blue. Blue is found within this violet. I could even change that violet and make it a bit more blue so that the relationship between the two colors is even closer, like that. So now I have a harmony of color, and the subordinate shape has been integrated into the larger shape here, the blue color. Now I'll check to see what the values look like. And you can see that the value of the triangle is much lighter than that of the square. Therefore, in terms of value, the triangle is not integrating with the value of the square. So right now I only have one dimension that is integrating with a dominant, the dominant blue color of the square. I need to form a stronger alliance between the subordinate triangle and the dominant square. So therefore, at least two dimensions or properties need to be in alliance with the dominant. That means making the value of the triangle darker. And now I'll check the value to see if it's similar in value to the square or the same. And the values look the same. So therefore, the value of the triangle is integrated with the value of the square, as well as the color. Therefore, I have now an alliance with two of the dominants, thereby establishing a strong integration of the subordinate shape with a dominant. And therefore, the subordinate shape is no longer isolated, but becomes part of the dominant. A union has been established because of this alliance of these properties. But now the value of the circle is contrasting sharply with the value of the other two shapes and is not integrated with those other shapes because of that. The only property that the circle has in common with the dominant square is the smooth texture. They both share that smooth texture. However, that isn't enough to establish a strong integration of the circle with the dominant. So right now, the circle acts as a discord. And a discord really doesn't integrate with any of the other elements of design. When a discord is introduced into a picture, it's usually kept very small. But even strong contrasts need to be integrated. Otherwise, they remain isolated from the rest of the composition and are not united with it. They will then seem out of place. So if the discord is larger, it needs to be made smaller, then you could get away with not integrating it. But if it's larger, like in this case, it really needs to be integrated some way into the rest of the composition. And I can do that with only one other property, and that is color. So if I repeat the blue color of the square within the circle here, I now integrate that circle with the square. The circle now becomes part of the rest of the composition. I don't need to use the same color. Remember what I said, you can still integrate elements of design by way of harmony. So they don't have to be exactly the same. You don't need to use repetition. If you introduce harmony, you introduce more variation and therefore more interest. So instead of the blue, I could use a different color, let's say a blue-green. It's closely related to the blue. And I could change the value also. Now the value is lighter and closer in value to the value of the square, although I could make it a little darker. Now I've integrated the circle by way of harmony, choosing a color that is not exactly the same as the square, but one that is in close relationship to the square. This arrangement now combines harmony, contrast, and unity. Harmony lies between the two extremes of monotony and discord. Monotony is created by exact repetition, as I showed you earlier, where there is no variation. There is a certain amount of contrast within harmony, as I showed you. So that contrast is found in the variations that I pointed out to you. Variation of color, variation of value. There are differences in value, differences in color. That is the contrast that is found in harmony. But that contrast is not great. It's not extreme contrast. Extreme contrast, as I pointed out to you, involves discord. And then there are lesser contrasts. There are different degrees of contrast that will determine how much or how little harmony you're establishing within your composition. Let's say I decide that there's too much harmony here and I want some greater amount of contrast added. So I want the circle to contrast more with the other shapes, but the circle still needs to be integrated with a dominant. And I think I'll add a red to the circle. That gives me the contrast that I'm looking for. However, the circle still integrates with a dominant, which is the dominant value of the square, because both the value of the circle and the value of the square are similar, or they can be the same. If they're the same, then there is unity. If they're similar, then there is harmony. So I've introduced more contrast and thereby introduced more interest into this arrangement, but yet the subordinate circle has been nevertheless integrated into the arrangement by having its value in alliance with the value of the square. That's what enables a union to form between these two contrasting shapes and colors. Here you can see that the value of the circle is similar to the value of the dominant, and therefore the two contrasting shapes are integrated, united, connected, tied together, linked. A union is formed, even though the values are not exactly the same. If they were exactly the same, the union would actually be stronger, but I wouldn't have the variety of values that I have now, and therefore it wouldn't be as interesting. Using simple abstractions like this makes it much easier to understand all of this that I've been explaining to you than if I started using more complex images. So therefore, once you understand it in more simple abstract terms like this, then it'll be much easier for you to understand what I've been showing you in more complex images, such as my rough color sketch here. Here all of the values are in conflict because they're all contrasting with each other, and as you learned, dominance resolves conflict. So therefore, in a case like this where there are these different values contrasting with each other, by applying dominance, you resolve this conflict. You find a solution to the problem of conflict or opposition or contrast. And by adding the value of the square back again to the triangle like I had before, I now have an even greater dominance of value than I had there before. Before, only the value of the square dominated. But by repeating that value in the value of the triangle, I now have even more dominance, and through dominance have also integrated this contrasting triangle shape with the square. So here's an example of how dominance integrates the elements of design and creates even more dominance. If I make that triangle white again, I still have dominance over here because there is more of this gray value than the other values. But I have less dominance than I had before, and because of that, the triangle is not integrated with the square. But by providing more dominance like this, making the triangle the same value again, I've now integrated the triangle with the square again. And the result is even more dominance. Getting back to this black and white here, what I want to do is change the value of the triangle, make that white, and then I'll change the value of the circle as well and turn that into a black. Now you see that each one of these shapes has a different value. Now the circle is a discord. It doesn't unite with the other shapes. And as you learned, the way to link it to the other shapes or unite it with the rest of the arrangement is by making it the same value like I did now. Therefore, there is no value contrast now because all the values are the same. And this results in unity. However, it's not a very interesting unity. So what I can do, as you learned, I can provide harmony by making the value a little bit darker, for example, like that. Now there's some variety in the values, like I pointed out to you earlier. There's harmony now, and it makes for a more interesting arrangement, and the circle still integrates with the other value because the values are similar. If I want strong contrast, then of course I introduce discord. Let's say I make the triangle really dark. Now the triangle does not integrate with the other values because it's too different. How do you integrate that contrasting value? Well, you have to make the color of the triangle the same as the color of the dominant here. So if the dominant shape is blue, then the triangle needs to be blue or some variation of blue so that it integrates with the square. It's like what I showed you earlier. And the blue would have to be darker because the value is dark, like that. So now I can introduce strong value contrast, but the shape still integrates with the dominant square shape because they both have blue in common. Remember, when elements of design have something in common, they are then linked or integrated, united. You can see that I turned the circle back into the same color that was there earlier, and it has the same value. So let me show you what all of this looks like in black and white. And you can see that there is variation of value even with that dark triangle down there acting as a strong contrast. The whole arrangement is integrated, unified, and has dominance in spite of the color contrasts and the value contrasts. And it has harmony as well. There's a harmonious relationship between these shapes, even though they contrast in value and color. Remember, harmony includes a certain amount of contrast. Now it's time to apply what you've been learning here in these simple abstractions to an actual painting. And I'll be showing you the kind of work that art students do when they focus on the wrong things, such as learning painting methods, learning various techniques, learning how to render objects so that they look realistic and beautiful, and focusing on what materials to use. All of those things are not as important as composition is. Composition is what makes the big difference between a bad work of art and a great work of art. It's not how beautifully you render objects. There's a lot more to art than that. And let me give you an example of what not to do. And here it is. Once you really understand all of what I've been showing you with these simple examples, then it's easier to apply that knowledge to more complex images like these and create effective compositions. To change this bad composition into one that reflects more of what I've shown you here in this example, I first need to relate these shapes of the figures to each other better. Right now, they do not relate to each other. And remember, art is all about creating relationships. And to relate or to create relationships refers to creating connections, unions, bonds. And here, in this example, there are no connections. Now, I showed you earlier how those connections can be formed, those relationships, how you can relate one element to another. The first thing I want to point out to you, which is the shape of these various characters. As you'll be learning later, there are three categories of shapes. And I'll just point them out to you here, but we'll repeat them later again to remind you of them and to show you some other things about shapes. This figure has an angular character like that, and he relates to the angular shapes, the category of angular shapes, or as they're also referred to, triangular shapes. This figure, however, falls into a different category of shapes, and that is rectangular shapes. See, it has that rectangular quality or character to the shapes. The first thing I want to point out to you, which is the shape of these various characters. As you'll be learning later, there are three categories of shapes, and I'll just point them out to you here, but we'll repeat them later again to remind you of them and to show you some other things about shapes. This figure has an angular character like that, and he relates to the angular shapes, the category of angular shapes, or as they're also referred to, triangular shapes. This figure, however, falls into a different category of shapes, and that is rectangular shapes. See, it has that rectangular quality or character to the shapes. Now, this figure here falls into the category of curving shapes. See how the contour or edge curves like this? So all these shapes are curving, because each of these figures has different kinds of shapes, they therefore do not relate to each other in terms of shapes. And this has to be changed. One kind of shape needs to dominate. That is, more of one kind of shape needs to be present within the composition than other shapes. I either have more of these angular or triangular shapes, or more rectangular shapes, or more of the curving shapes. There can be other shapes besides just having one dominant shape, and those other shapes, however, must be fewer in number, and they are the subordinate or subdominant shapes, and they help to add interest through contrast. So rather than have all the shapes within the composition only of one kind of shape, which would make it a bit monotonous, interest is added by adding contrasting shapes. So I can still have rectangular shapes and curving shapes, as well as the angular shapes, all together within one composition. But, like I said, there needs to be one shape that dominates or predominates within the composition. This idea of being able to have contrasting shapes is what I showed you here. The circle and the triangle contrast with the dominant shape of the square, but I was able to integrate those contrasting shapes with this dominant. And so that same idea can be applied here. But in this case, the sizes are all too much the same. Therefore, I can't have all these shapes different in shape. If you look over here, you see that the circle is smaller, as well as the triangle, than the square is. It's the largest size, and therefore it dominates over the smaller sizes of these shapes. And if I apply that same idea to this picture, by making this figure larger and keeping these smaller, and then changing their value in color like I did here, I can integrate them with the dominant figure or shape, just as I did in this example. Now let me point something out to you. While there is dominance here, because this shape is larger, dominance has been achieved through size. Dominance of size is what you find here. However, if I change this triangle to a square, what I now have is an even stronger dominance than I had before, because now there is dominance through number, which means that there is even more now of one kind of shape than another, thereby increasing the amount of dominance by multiplying the number of shapes that are the same. So you see, you can have more or less dominance. The more dominance, the more unity. Remember that it is only through dominance that unity can be achieved. You must have more of one kind of shape, more of one kind of color, more of one kind of size, more of one kind of value, and so forth, than another, in order to achieve dominance and thereby unity, so that the whole composition holds together. What I can do to begin with is change the character of this shape here, of this figure, to an angular shape like you see in this figure. Therefore, I'll eliminate this. I'll enlarge this figure and then change the shape to an angular one, like this. See how angular the contour has become? And even the helmet can have an angular character to it. You see how angular that is? This whole shape here has an angular character. Now what I'm going to do is enlarge this figure here so that I get dominance of size like you see in this example. By applying angular shapes to this figure and then having angular shapes to this figure amounts to what I showed you here, where I repeated this square shape in this smaller shape. I've changed the color of this figure so that it now relates to the color of this figure more closely. The two colors are in harmony. This one is blue-green, while this one is blue. They are next to each other on the color wheel that you'll be learning about later in the lessons on color. Instead of forming harmony, I could establish repetition like I did here by repeating the blue of this square in the blue of the smaller square, thereby creating a very strong bond, integrating them even more strongly than if the colors were different. If the color, for example, instead of being blue here, I made it a blue-green, like this, there's still a bond between the two colors. There's still an integration. But now there's more variation of hue or color, and establishing harmony instead of repetition, just as I did in this example here, where I varied the hue. A quick way to unify the entire picture through color is by using a monochromatic color scheme, which means using just one color. And a quick way to do that is to go to Hue Saturation in Photoshop and then click on Colorize. And you see what happened? Everything now has become blue. And this unifies the entire picture through the use of only one color. However, it's not as interesting as when more variation of color is added. This kind of color scheme is more monotonous because only one color is found throughout the picture, and only the intensity of the color and the value of the color are varied. Now it's time to create a new arrangement here by first of all enlarging this figure, and let me bring him forward like this, creating a dominant size. Remember what I said in the abstract diagram over here about creating a dominant size. And I can go even larger. Now I have dominance of size and dominance of shape, because this other figure has the same kind of angular shapes that this large foreground figure has. In order for this diagram to correspond more closely to what I'm doing here in this picture, I changed the shapes, as you can see. The triangles represent the angular shapes or triangular shapes found in the foreground figure and in this other figure here, whereas the rectangle corresponds to the rectangle shapes of the woman. I also used the colors in this diagram that I used for my picture here. You can see the blue triangle corresponds to the blue figure here, and the red-violet here corresponds to the red-violet of the woman, and of course the blue-green corresponds to the blue-green found in this large figure. The rectangle is more closely related to the triangle shape than the circle is. However, I need to create a stronger bond between the rectangle shape and the triangle shape. Therefore, I need to create a stronger bond between this foreground figure and the woman in the background. So, right now, the rectangle is integrated with the triangle by way of both having the same smooth texture and the same value, so they're integrated, but I can create an even stronger alliance between these shapes by repeating an additional property, such as color. So instead of having the red-violet here, I could change that to the green of the triangle. Now there's a stronger bond, a greater union between these shapes, and I can do the same now for the woman back here. And I'll see what that looks like. I'm not sure if I'm going to leave it like that, like what you see here. I may decide to change this color again. First I have to see what it looks like on the woman. And I changed the color of the woman to a blue-green. Now, I think the two are much more closely related, even though one figure has an angular character shapes while the other has a rectangular character shapes. Nevertheless, what I think I'm going to do is change the color to blue and see what that looks like. So I'll go over to Hue Saturation, check Colorize, and then change the color to a blue, like that. And the man here in the background, I'm going to change to blue-green. Like that. The blue on the female pushes her further back. And what I have to do over here, where the diagram is, I'll change that rectangle to a blue, since the woman now is blue, and the man is blue-green, so I'll change the smaller triangle to a blue-green, the same color as the large triangle. I changed the background color, this portion here, to blue-green, which repeats the blue-green found in the figures, thereby integrating the background with the color of these two figures. The yellow-orange that was there contrasted too much with the blue-green and competed with it, so that there wasn't a clear color dominance. And by making the background blue-green, as well as the two figures, now there's a strong color dominance.